have a joint interest in making sure that Putin does not win this war.
Ukraine belongs to the European family, and it's quite evident now these days that Ukrainians also want to join EU.
We welcome all efforts for peace, but it has to be about preserving Ukrainian sovereignty, territorial integrity, and make sure it's a just and lasting peace.
Hi, this is Martin Fornusek from the Kyiv Independent, reporting here from Lviv in Ukraine, where European ministers gather to discuss Ukraine's effort to join the EU. The meeting is taking place at a challenging time for Ukraine. The US renewed pressure for Ukraine to accept a swift peace deal with Moscow, potentially even at the cost of painful concessions. Ukraine, meanwhile, has been rocked by a major corruption scandal, which reached the highest levels of government. Today we are talking with Danish European Affairs Minister Bjerre and her Swedish counterpart Jessica Rosencrantz to discuss Ukraine's efforts to join the EU, the fallout of the corruption scandal, and the EU's role in the negotiations. We are meeting here, of course, to discuss Ukraine's efforts to join the EU. Looking back at the past year, is Ukraine any closer to membership?
I would say absolutely. Ukraine has done enormous progress during the last year, which is particularly impressive, of course, being in war, but also being able to do real reforms. And what we really see now, when the Commission has done its sort of review of all the candidate countries, is that Ukraine is now really described as one of 4 frontrunners in the process of becoming a member. And that's a real step forward alongside the real reforms that have been carried out, not least on what we call the fundamental areas, that is rule of law and economic parameters relating to this, which I think also illustrates a good point that we are often making, is that for Ukraine to join the EU is also an economic benefit to all of Europe, when we can also strengthen the Ukrainian economy, but also the European. So I would say definitely that a lot of progress has been made, and being a front runner now so clearly is really impressive.
Absolutely. And of course, it is a disappointment that we were not able to open formally negotiation clusters with Ukraine. But we knew that that would be nearly impossible, because we have one country blocking, and it requires unanimity. Hungary is still blocking. They were blocking during the Polish presidency, and they're still blocking. But in fact, the enlargement process with Ukraine is not at a standstill, because we, during our presidency, we have front-loaded all the technical work, meaning that Ukraine has delivered on reforms and all the paperwork, and so have the Council and the Commission. So when there's no blockades, then we will actually be able to move very fast. And that's why we're here in Ukraine today and tomorrow for this meeting, to show our support to Ukraine, and also to take a status on this new approach towards enlargement, so we can continue with that approach, so the enlargement procedure can actually continue.
Recently there was a major corruption scandal in Ukraine, which reached even figures close to President Zelensky. His chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, resigned. Can this corruption scandal somehow impact or even hamper Ukraine's efforts to join the EU?
I mean, to be very honest, this is very serious. And fighting corruption, I would say, is one of the real important aspects also of becoming a member in the European Union. And it's, of course, important in so many aspects. So it's very serious. But it's also quite clear that in Ukraine there is a serious investigation now into what has happened, which is really good, but of course also necessary. And we will continue to encourage Ukraine to carry out further reforms on this area and other important areas when it comes to rule of law. Because basically the EU is not just a geographical union, it's a union based on values, which we all need to live up to, current member states and those who want to join. And in that aspect, fighting corruption is really important. And it's important to have democracy, to have transparency, but I also believe it's really important for future economic growth. When we listen to Swedish companies, for example, when they decide where to do their new investments in which countries, anti-corruption, transparency, institutions that work, those are crucial aspects. So I would say fighting corruption is necessary both for preserving and achieving democracy and transparency, but also for economic growth.
Of course, the corruption scandal were huge, and corruption is never acceptable. And you have to fight corruption in order to become a member of EU. But the fact that things are now being disclosed, are now open in the public, the fact that there is now anti-corruption agencies functioning in Ukraine is a very positive sign. It shows that things are working. Ukraine is working with anti-corruption. So I don't think it did have an effect on the enlargement procedure as such.
Regarding peace talks, we see that there is again renewed push by the US to conclude some kind of peace deal in Ukraine, but we saw Americans mainly talking either to the Ukrainian side or to the Russian side. Is the EU being sidelined from the negotiations?
Well, there are a lot of talks about different plans and different numbers of points in each plan, 28-point plan and whatnot. We have a 2-point plan, that is to support Ukraine and to put pressure on Russia. And that is what we need to continue to do. Because for the Swedish government, supporting Ukraine is our most important foreign policy priority in all aspects. Militarily, also on the way to EU membership. But I would say that is our plan. Continue to provide support and continue to put pressure on Russia. And of course, we support all efforts to create peace as long as this is a long and just peace. One that respects Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and it's really important that peace is not just a pause until Russia decides to attack again. So that's why we need to have a peace that is really long-term and which also enables Ukraine to really be able to defend itself also in the long term so that Russia does not simply attack again. Because for us it's obvious that Russia will be a threat to all of our security in the foreseeable future. So we welcome all efforts for peace, but it has to be about preserving Ukrainian sovereignty, territorial integrity, and make sure it's a just and lasting peace.
First of all, we support the efforts from US to make peace, and it's a good thing that US are engaged in wanting peace between Ukraine and Russia. There's nothing that Ukraine wants more than peace, so that is a very good thing. But of course, it worries us that there are talks with Russia about Ukraine without Ukraine. It also worries us as Europeans that there are talks about Europe without Europe at the table. So it has to be a peace agreement with Ukraine, and if there are talks about Europe, it should also be with us.
So what exactly can the EU do? What kind of tools can it use to help Ukraine achieve this just and lasting peace, and also to show to Russia and to the US that the EU is still a strong and relevant actor in this peace process?
Well, of course, it's very clear that all, peace negotiations or conclusions about Ukraine has to have Ukraine at the table, and all decisions on European security has to have also Europe at the table. Going back to our, main points about support to Ukraine and pressure on Russia, I think that is precisely what we can do. And right now we are in a quite decisive moment in the EU. Next week, Sweden is pushing for a decision on making use of the frozen Russian central bank assets to make sure that these funds can be used as a loan to Ukraine. And to me, that it's obvious that we need to provide Ukraine with support, but it's also important to make sure that Russia is held accountable and that we make Russia pay for the damage that Russia has caused to Ukraine. So I would say that decision is very important in providing support for Ukraine. And we also need to continuously impose new sanctions. I would say each time EU decides on a new sanctions package, it's time to look at the next one, because we continuously need to put increased pressure on Russia, also looking at import tariffs and all the means that are available. But I think this is what we really can do, and make sure that Ukraine is in a position of strength once real peace negotiations are entered. And we will always be very supportive of the fact that it is ultimately Ukraine that decides on what parameters that Ukraine wants to accept a peace deal.
Europe plays an important role for Ukraine. We already today play an important role in supporting Ukraine, but also in the future role, because Ukraine is a European country. Ukraine belongs to the European family, and it's quite evident now these days that Ukrainians also want to join EU. So therefore, EU plays a huge role in the future prosperity of Ukraine.
But of course, Belgium has been blocking the efforts to use the Russian assets for the so-called reparations loan. Are you optimistic that some kind of consensus can be reached by the upcoming summit in Brussels, or should the EU start already exploring some other ways of long-term support for Ukraine?
Well, we are pushing for an agreement next week. It's really important. We know that there are budgetary needs in Ukraine, and we know that we have a responsibility, I would say, from the EU side to also provide Ukraine with support. I know that there are questions, not least from Belgium, who holds a lot of these funds in its country, so to say. You know, I understand that there are those questions, and I think we need to sort them out as far as it's possible. But we also need to realize the cost of doing nothing. And we need to realize that it is acute, the situation in Ukraine, and that we need to act now. So you never know, but we will go into next week's meeting with a definitive push to make sure that we have a deal next week. If we don't, we have to look at other options. And we are not ruling out anything, including joint borrowing or some other kind of mechanism. But I'd say that this is the real potential is really with using the Russian central bank for a reparations loan, as it also makes Russia pay for the damage that it has caused. But these funds will not be enough either. So Sweden is also ramping up our bilateral support to Ukraine. We have increased our bilateral support each year since the full-scale invasion, and we expect also more countries to do more when it comes to bilateral support.
Well, that is very, very difficult. But there can be no doubt that we need to find a model to support Ukraine financially, also militarily. But Ukraine is in a huge need for support financially, and we have to deliver in Europe. Right now, Ukraine is also fighting for our freedom, so we have to support Ukraine, and we need to find a suitable model. We, as the Danish presidency, we support that we can find a model with the reparation loan, but it is very difficult, and we need to find the right model, sustainable model. And that's what we're looking into, and the leaders will discuss this next week.
Unfortunately, we see this image where Hungary blocks the accession talks, Belgium blocks the reparations loan. Is the EU unity on Ukraine fracturing just when it's needed the most?
I would say that we have a real strong European support behind Ukraine, which we see in basically all the discussions that I am having with my minister colleagues or in other forums. We really see that there is a strong support, but I'd say that I just said that it's also important not only to support by words, but also with concrete action and with money. We have seen a lot of support. I mean, after the full-scale invasion, I think, I think Putin believed that the EU or Europe would sort of, cave immediately, would not stand up to its principles. But we have, I would say, a very strong, united behind Ukraine, with a full realization that the Ukrainian people are not just fighting for Ukraine's freedom and future, but for all of our European security. But of course we can do even more, and that's why Sweden tries to act through leadership by also showing that it is possible to have a strong bilateral support, and also push for measures such as using the Russian central bank assets, which would never have been possible, of course, a couple of years ago, but these are very special circumstances and where we need to look at new measures.
Well, it has always been difficult because we are 27 sovereign nations with different opinions. Of course, in some areas, it's difficult that things require unanimity, and especially these days. And there are intensive pressure on changing those procedures. It is also a Danish stand that we should have more qualified majority in certain areas, especially in the foreign policy when it comes to sanction packages, also in the enlargement procedure, instead of unanimity. But that requires unanimity to change, so it's more a theoretical talk.
And finally, just reacting to the latest developments, there has been a lot of criticism toward the EU coming from the Trump administration. We saw it in this new national strategy document. We heard it from President Trump himself, that European leadership is weak, and we even heard criticism regarding Europe's stance on the war. Do you still think that the US and the EU are strategic partners in this peace process? And are their goals still aligned when it comes to Ukraine?
I mean, there are points being made from the American side that Europe should do more on European security, for example. And that is not something new for this administration. We have heard that before as well, perhaps with another tone, but we've heard it before. And I think in that aspect, I agree that Europe should do more on our own security. Sweden has doubled our defense investments in just a couple of years. We now have a new NATO target, which all of the countries are working to reach, and Sweden has a clear process for reaching that new NATO goal. So in that sense, I think it's important to see that we need to do more in preserving peace on our own continent. I think it's very important for Europe and US to continue to be allies, because we need to stand up for the principles of democracy and rule of law and all these values that we hold very high. But I would like to say that Europe is today the largest provider of support to Ukraine. So I'm proud of what we are doing in that sense, and I'm very proud of the Swedish support. Meanwhile, of course, we're continuously pushing for even more support. But in that sense, I would say that Europe is taking a great part of the responsibility. But there's always room to do more. But we must continue to, of course, be close allies with the US, because we have a joint interest in making sure that Putin does not win this war, because then I think it will be a threat to all European countries, but also to all of us in the world, holding values high when it comes to democracy and peace, and really showing that it's not up to a big country to do what they want with their neighbors, but we need to preserve the global world order and the rules-based world order.
So US is a very important ally for Europe, and hopefully US and Europe will continue to work closely together, because we stand stronger in the world if US and Europe stand together, fight together. That has been the case in the history, and that is still the case. But of course, I am very surprised to see the critique of EU, the criticism of democracy in Europe, which does not describe the situation in Europe. And also, we need a strong Europe in a new geopolitical world order. I also see some that want to tear EU apart, and that Europe should rather be member countries, sovereign member countries without no EU. If that is the future, we would be very weak. We need to be together in order to be strong.
Every edit, every video you see is powered by our community. If you want to support our work, please consider becoming a paying member at kyivindependent.com/membership. Thank you.